She was a foreign widow, surrounded by loss, yet chosen to carry the lineage of the Messiah. How could an unlikely woman, nameless among her people, become the link between despair and salvation? And what does that reveal about a God who works in silence while the soul is bleeding? This isn't just a love story, it's a story of faithfulness that withstood famine, grief, and rejection, and became one of the greatest promises of redemption in the Bible. If you've ever thought of giving up, Ruth will show you why you shouldn't, because the forgotten woman in the fields of Bethlehem would become the bridge between human despair and the birth of the Messiah. And through this journey, you'll discover how divine providence can turn even the darkest chapter into a genealogy of promise. She lost everything, her husband, her livelihood, her identity, and yet she stayed. When everything screamed, "Go back," Ruth chose to remain, not where safety was, but where faith was. What made her follow a bitter woman to a people who didn't want her, and a God who seemed distant? The wind blew dry across the hills of Moab. Ruth's face, marked by dust and grief, stared into the void with resolute eyes. Before her, Naomi was no longer the woman she once was. Time and pain had emptied her, and in that moment, no one could say who was more wounded, the mother-in-law who had lost everything, or the daughter-in-law who'd never had much to begin with. But in the midst of that emotional wilderness, a phrase broke through the darkness. "Your people shall be my people, your God, my God." It wasn't just a declaration of affection, it was a spiritual act, a silent vow that would echo across the centuries. Without even knowing it, Ruth had just stepped into a story far greater than her pain. That's how divine providence works, not in thunder, but in the unseen choices. Faithfulness isn't born in victory, it's born in loss. And the woman of faith the world had ignored was being written into the pages of eternity. The return to Bethlehem was quiet. There was no celebration. The town whispered Naomi's name, now bitter, now empty. "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara." But beside her, silent, stood Ruth, present, steady, invisible to men, but seen by heaven. That presence was all Naomi had, and all God needed, because sometimes redemption begins with a simple, "I'm still here." And while the world moves on, distracted, God's plan is already in motion. There was no music, no warm welcome, just the dry sound of footsteps pressing into the familiar soil, now so far removed from what Naomi remembered. Bethlehem looked the same, but she didn't. The town whispered her name, but she rejected it. "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." A heavy face, empty eyes. The woman who once left with a husband and sons now returned with a broken soul and a foreigner as her only companion. But there was something about that Moabite woman that even Naomi couldn't explain. She didn't complain, she didn't question, she simply stayed. Even under suspicious stares, even hearing whispers in the streets, Ruth walked with steady eyes. Her silence was an answer, her presence an act of faith. And though no one could see it, something in heaven had begun to move. It was divine providence at work, not through lightning or loud promises, but through the strength of invisible faithfulness. On the first morning, while Naomi still lingered in bed, Ruth got up. The house was empty, so was her soul, but there was a pull inside her, not born from need, but from faith. She didn't ask for permission. She simply grabbed a worn-out sack and stepped out, with no plan, no promise, not even knowing what she was really looking for. It wasn't food she sought. It was meaning. She wandered the hills of Bethlehem like someone searching for something they didn't know how to name. She saw the fields in the distance, men harvesting barley, women carrying bundles. It was a season of plenty for others. But then a window opened. A group drifted away, leaving a corner of the field exposed. There, among leftovers and forgotten stalks, the unexpected began. Ruth stepped forward in humility, unaware that in that very moment, the biblical story of Ruth was entering a new chapter, where the unseen would become more real than the visible. She gathered what little she could and returned, not with abundance, but with fruit. And when Naomi saw what she brought, she froze. Where did this come from? It wasn't the amount that stood out, it was the way Ruth offered it, with reverence, with peace, with hope. Something stirred in Naomi. A memory flickered, not of the land she had lost, but of the God she thought had stayed behind. In the days that followed, Ruth returned to that same corner. She didn't speak to the harvesters. She didn't force her way in. She simply showed up and gathered what no one else noticed. It was little, but it was consistent. And Naomi, day after day, began to see, not with her eyes, but with her soul, that Moabite woman. She was different. One afternoon, as Ruth arrived with yet another handful, Naomi held back tears, not because of how much she brought, but because she never stopped. Naomi herself had let faith slip through her fingers, but this woman, without a promise, without a covenant, without a name in Israel, remained steadfast. And for the first time since she returned, Naomi spoke without bitterness. Maybe the Lord still sees. It wasn't certainty, but it was the beginning of restoration. A thread of silent redemption starting to stretch out quietly. That night, while Ruth slept, Naomi lay awake. The sky looked the same, but inside her, something had begun to move. Ruth's invisible faithfulness had awakened what grief had numbed, and the woman who had asked to be called Mara was, in secret, starting to remember what it felt like to be Naomi. She said nothing yet, but her eyes saw everything differently. It was as if Ruth's faith had cracked the shell of bitterness, letting a thread of hope slip in. And with each passing day, that hope was taking shape, gaining color and direction. If this biblical story of Ruth is speaking to your soul, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that divine providence is still at work, even when everything feels like silence. Every like and every new subscriber helps us stay strong, revealing the secrets of Scripture and how invisible faithfulness can lead to silent redemption. Tell us in the comments, what is Ruth's attitude awakening in you so far? Your reflection might strengthen someone else's journey today. Meanwhile, in the field, Ruth continued with steady steps, but now each movement seemed to carry more than effort. It carried purpose. The woman Naomi had brought from Moab was no longer seen merely as a foreigner. Something about her was being recognized, even if silently, and Naomi could feel it. With every bundle Ruth brought home at night, with every display of humility, with every absence of complaint, a conviction grew inside her. That kind of faithfulness was drawing something sacred. The town had no idea. The workers didn't understand, but heaven was watching. And there was someone, a righteous man, who had begun to take notice. One afternoon, Ruth returned with more than grain. She came back with a name. "The man's name is Boaz," she said, unaware of what she had just stirred in her mother-in-law. Naomi's expression shifted, not from surprise, but from memory. She knew that name. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech. He was part of the lineage, and more than that, by law, he was a possible redeemer. Naomi didn't smile, but she stood taller. Something inside her was coming into alignment. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration, the kind of detail that doesn't come from chance, but from divine providence. "My daughter, stay where he told you. Don't go to other fields." Her voice no longer sounded frail. It sounded like someone beginning to understand. For the first time, Naomi wasn't speaking about what she had lost. She was speaking about what could be restored. Boaz, in turn, didn't act on impulse. He watched Ruth from a distance. He had seen her effort, her care, her humility, but what impressed him most was the kind of faith she carried, invisible faithfulness, a devotion that expected nothing in return, and to a righteous man, that didn't go unnoticed. Quietly, he began instructing his workers, "Do not touch her. Let some stalks fall for her. Let her drink from the water you drink." This wasn't charity. It was a sacred gesture. Silent redemption was beginning to be woven, not with grand speeches, but with subtle acts. Ruth didn't know what it all meant, but she felt the weight of kindness. Boaz's mercy was like a cool shadow after a long day in the sun, and even without fully understanding, she remained faithful. Naomi began listening to Ruth's reports with different ears. Now, every detail was weighed with care. The field was no longer just a setting, it had become a bridge. Not merely a place of survival, but the beginning of a turning point. She still didn't say everything she was thinking, but she began to plan. Because Boaz's care wasn't random, it was a sign, it was an invitation, and his name, echoing back into their home, felt like the breath of a new season. "My daughter, listen closely. There's something that needs to be done." The words came softly, but were charged with destiny. It wasn't a command, it was a calling. Ruth's faith had brought in a harvest, but now it was time to reap something deeper, purpose. And Naomi knew this plan didn't belong to them, it belonged to heaven. Ruth kept working in the field, but now each of her movements seemed to carry more than effort. They carried purpose. The woman Naomi had brought from Moab was no longer seen merely as a foreigner. Something in her was being acknowledged, even if silently, and Naomi could feel it. Boaz watched her, but not with the eyes of a landowner, with eyes of discernment. He didn't approach carelessly. He moved with intention. He knew who she was. He knew what she had done for Naomi, and he knew that something in this woman's faithfulness reminded him of God himself. Without realizing it, Ruth had stepped into sacred ground. She had earned respect. But Boaz didn't act on emotion. He tested through the details. He instructed his men to leave stalks for her. He ordered that no one disturb her. And he waited. He wanted to see if her consistency came from need or from faith. He wanted to understand whether she harvested simply because she lacked or because she believed. Day after day, Ruth returned with the same posture, humble, quiet, steady. She sweated under the sun, knelt to the ground, carried the heavy weight of barley, and still shared everything with Naomi. She didn't complain. She didn't force anything. She simply stayed the course. Naomi, watching it all, began to awaken. The bitter woman was starting to see again. Her eyes, once marked by loss, began to notice signs, and between Ruth's reports and the quiet rhythms of their days, Naomi understood a path was opening. And that path led through Boaz. He wasn't just any man. He was a relative of Elimelech, one of the legal redeemers, and that word, redeemer, began to burn in Naomi's heart like prophecy. She knew she couldn't force anything, but she also knew when God's providence begins to move, you must be alert. And so she began to speak to Ruth differently, not as a mother-in-law, but as a spiritual mentor. "My daughter, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes." It wasn't vanity, it was sanctification, it was a positioning of the heart, a sign that something sacred was about to unfold. The season of silent waiting had come to an end. Now it was time to act, not out of impulse, but out of faith. Naomi didn't give her every detail at once. She said just enough. She guided her with wisdom. She told her where Boaz would be, how he would behave, and most importantly, when she should draw near. Tradition said that when the harvest was finished, the owner of the land would sleep beside the grain on the threshing floor. That was where decisions were guarded, where the fruit of labor was protected. It was a place of watchfulness. And in that humble setting, Ruth would be called to take a step that carried the weight of her entire journey thus far. She didn't protest, she didn't hesitate, she simply listened, held the instructions close, and prepared her heart. It wasn't easy, it wasn't light, but it was clear. God was orchestrating something, and she was willing to follow, even without guarantees. That night, Ruth washed herself. She anointed her skin. She dressed like someone walking into a destiny she hadn't asked for, but now embraced. Each gesture was silent, each preparation a prayer, each fold of the fabric a surrender. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She was no longer in the season of gathering stalks. She had entered the season of gathering answers, and as the night fell over Bethlehem, heaven watched the beginning of a new chapter. one that wouldn't be decided in the field, but on the threshing floor. The city slept, but heaven was awake. Ruth walked silently along the paths that led to the threshing floor. Her steps were light, but her spirit carried the full weight of faith. There were no more doubts, only surrender. Everything that could be done had already been done. Now was the time to trust. There lay Boaz, resting beside the heap of grain, as was the custom at the end of the harvest. His breathing calm, his face peaceful, his body at rest. Ruth approached slowly. No gesture out of place, no word spoken too soon. She knew what this act meant. To spread one's cloak wasn't seduction. It was covenant. It was the silent cry of someone not asking for romance, but for belonging, for redemption. She lay at his feet, not as one who demands, but as one who waits. Time passed without hurry until Boaz awoke. He sensed something, shifted, and as he noticed Ruth's presence, he asked in a confused, hushed voice, "Who are you?" And there, at the most vulnerable point in her journey, Ruth answered with the confidence of someone who knows her place before God, even without knowing her place among men. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me, for you are a redeemer." It was more than a request. It was a declaration of trust. The pinnacle of a silent faith that had endured grief, hunger, and obscurity, now standing before destiny. Boaz paused for a moment, then answered like a man who understood the spiritual weight of the moment. "Blessed are you of the Lord. You have shown greater faithfulness in this act than in all before. You didn't chase after young men or wealth. You remained where purpose was." He didn't touch her. He didn't misread the gesture. He didn't twist its meaning. He simply honored it for what it was, a vow before God. But there was tension. Boaz revealed there was another relative, one with a closer right to redeem. He couldn't act in haste. The justice of God is never built through shortcuts. Still, he made a promise. "If he will not redeem you, I will, as the Lord lives." And then, with care, he asked Ruth to leave before dawn, to protect her honor, to preserve the sacred meaning of that encounter. Before she left, he filled her cloak with barley, not just for provision, but as a symbol, a silent seal that something had begun. The weight of that grain was also the weight of hope. Ruth returned in the dark, but the path was no longer the same. Inside her there was light, not because she knew what would happen, but because she knew in whom she trusted. Naomi was waiting. She hadn't slept. She had been praying. When she heard footsteps at the door, she rose. And when Ruth entered, her eyes searched for an answer. Ruth told her calmly, truthfully, and Naomi simply said, "Wait, my daughter. That man will not rest until this matter is settled." She knew. Divine providence was already in motion, and while Bethlehem still slept, heaven was at work. The sun had barely risen when Boaz left the threshing floor. His feet touched the earth like a man carrying a mission. He was no longer just a man of the field. Now, he was a man of destiny. Ruth's request echoed within him, and he knew, when faithfulness knocks at the door, providence demands a response. The city gate was more than an entryway. It was where covenants were sealed, where inheritances were decided before witnesses. And that's where Boaz sat, with firmness, with urgency, with purpose. He called for 10 elders. They came, they sat, they waited. The other Redeemer, the man who, by law, held the first right, also arrived, and Boaz spoke with clarity, without pressure. "Naomi has returned from Moab and wishes to sell the portion of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech." The relative listened, considered, and responded, "I will redeem it." But Boaz continued, "On the day you acquire the land, you must also take Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, as your wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance." Silence. The man's decision shifted. "I cannot redeem it, lest I endanger my own inheritance. Redeem it yourself." And then he removed his sandal, an ancient gesture but rich in meaning. It was the public seal of surrendering one's right, a formal renunciation, and at the same time a release from heaven. Boaz stood and declared, "You are witnesses this day that I have acquired all that belonged to Elimelech, and that I take Ruth the Moabitess as my wife, so the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers." It wasn't an emotional speech. It was a covenant, sealed with words and with presence. The elders listened, the city heard, and the people gave their blessing. They invoked over Boaz and Ruth the names of Rachel and Leah, unlikely women whom God used to build Israel. And they spoke of Tamar, a foreign widow like Ruth, grafted by faith into a sacred lineage. It was as if the people recognized something eternal was being written before their eyes. There was no music, no spectacle, but there was honor, there was justice. There was an answer. The silent redemption that began in the fields was now official, public, irrevocable. Boaz returned home, not as a hero, but as a man of covenant. The marriage took place, not out of impulse, but out of purpose. And from the union of two unlikely people, God began to write a new chapter in history. In Ruth's womb now rested more than provision. There was promise. There was inheritance. She who had arrived a widow, gathering scraps in the fields, was now carrying the beginning of a lineage. And without knowing it, she was becoming a mother, not just to a son, but to a line that would one day change the world. Obed was born, small in the eyes of the world, eternal in the eyes of God. The woman who had endured grief in silence, who stayed when nothing promised a return, now held in her arms the fruit of faithfulness. Not just a child, but a link, a name, a legacy. The neighbors rejoiced. They said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer," and they placed the child in her lap. The woman who once asked to be called Mara was now cradling redemption in her own hands. But the story doesn't end with Obed. From him would come Jesse, from Jesse David, and from David Jesus. The foreign woman, once forgotten in the fields of Bethlehem, now became part of the Messiah's lineage. Because divine providence isn't limited by human boundaries, it weaves the improbable into the eternal. Ruth appears in only 4 chapters of the Bible, and in none of them does she perform miracles or deliver great speeches. But in her, God reveals one of the Bible's greatest secrets. Silent redemption is just as powerful as mighty deeds, because he doesn't choose the strongest, he chooses the most faithful. She entered the story as a widow. She left it as the mother of kings. She gathered scraps. Now she gathered inheritance, not because she sought greatness, but because she said yes, even without understanding the end of the story. Her invisible faithfulness activated something no human eye could have foreseen. And that's why, when Matthew begins the genealogy of Christ, he doesn't start with miracles, he starts with names. And among them is Ruth, a Moabite, a broken woman who chose to stay, a foreigner grafted into the promise. This is one of the greatest acts of divine theological interpretation, to show that salvation doesn't come through the perfect, but through the willing. The lineage of the Savior is marked by Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Mary, unlikely women, scarred by pain, remembered for their faith. Ruth didn't seek a place in history, she sought a place in God's will, and that was enough for her name to be preserved for all eternity. The story that began with hunger, grief, and rejection ends with birth, abundance, and blessing. And it leaves us with a question. How many promises are waiting for a faithfulness like Ruth's? How many lineages are still to be born from the heart of someone who simply decides to stay when everything says to go? Because it's not the size of our strength that activates heaven. It's the decision to remain when no one else believes. If this journey touched your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember, God still sees the invisible. And in the comments, answer sincerely, what did God speak to you through the story of Ruth? Your response could awaken faith in someone who's on the verge of giving up.